Symposium 2021. And this is the first track. So this is the evolving crisis of food waste from farm to fork. We've had a really interesting morning and heard from two fantastic keynote speakers. We're going to continue the conversation around food waste, and we've got 5 presentations today. So I've just put them in alphabetical order, but I'm happy to change this around if people want to present at different times. So we're going to hear about consumers' perceptions of smart labelling, a situated approach first, and then I'm going to present some of my PhD research. Then we're going to hear about consumer edibility perceptions, the Edibility Threshold, and then we've got 2 final presentations, hospitality, food waste, influencing others to prevent food waste, identify new product opportunities from waste, eliminating waste in tomato production. So I can see we've got the first presentation speaker joining us. So would they like to go forward and present? So we have around 15 minutes for each presentation, and then 5 minutes of questions. So we're in this track for around 2 hours, I think it is, until 12:40. And if you have any questions, please post them in the chat, and we'll have that time after each presentation. So I'll stop sharing and go over to Ada. Maria, hello.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you for joining us.
I'll share my screen. Let's see. 1 second. I have a new laptop and I think I have to give some kind of accessibility. I'm really sorry. Okay, let's see. I think I have to leave the meeting and come back.
Okay.
I don't know if I can start, or if you want to go forward with someone else, I can not to waste any time. I can present after you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to go instead of. Okay,
I'll be back.
So I'll start us off then with my PhD research. But if anyone else wants to kind of joining after Ada, Maria, please kind of get your presentation ready and check you can share your screen, etc. Okay. So
I will try 1 second.
Okay, have one go. Oh, okay, there we go.
Can you see? Okay,
we
perfect.
can see.
Thank you. Okay, I will put it. Okay, here we go. So good morning, everyone. So my name is Ada Maria Barone, and I'm currently a lecturer in marketing at Goldsmiths, University of London. But until more or less a week ago, I was a postdoc at Aarhus University. So this is a work that I developed during my postdoc in Denmark. And it's in collaboration with Jessica Aschemann-Witzel, who is also a professor over there. And it's a study that has been funded by EIT Food, and it's been run in collaboration with Mimica, which is a UK-based company, for which I'm going to give you a little bit more details later on during the presentation. So overall, in general, my presentation is going to be about consumer perception of smart labels aimed at tackling food waste. So first of all, as I think everybody knows in this symposium, I want to start with why it is important to study food waste. As we probably all know, more than 900 million tons of food are still wasted each year, and particularly 61% of this food is generated inside the household. So this simple statistics tells us that basically the main contributor to food waste is actually the consumer, so the individual, which suggests the need to develop solutions and interventions that target consumer behavior. So throughout the years and in recent years, when talking about food waste, many solutions have been proposed in this sense. For instance, we can think about helping consumers to better plan their meals, or helping consumers to better plan their shopping trips, so to avoid later on food waste inside the household. However, as you can see, food waste has not decreased as we were hoping for. So this means that maybe and probably we need novel and more effective solutions that help consumers reduce food waste. So in recent years, some technological and novel innovations have been developed to help consumers reduce food waste, and so overall solve the food waste problem. One of them is so-called intelligent packaging, which is a packaging that contains sensors or indicators that monitor the condition on food during its life cycle. So the idea of intelligent packaging is that the consumers will have a package that tells them whether the food is still fresh to consume. So in this way, consumers will have a real-time measure of quality of the product, which will allow them potentially to consume the product even after the expiry date. Similarly, recently, many companies and retailers are developing so-called smart labels or freshness indicators, which are labels that are placed on the package and that tell consumers whether the food is still fresh to consume. So more or less, the intelligent packaging and smart labels have the same function for consumers, but are different in the sense the intelligent packaging is the way the package is designed, while the smart label can be simply placed on the package itself. Basically, what happens with smart labels is that usually there is a chemical composition in the label that reacts with the characteristics of the product and so gives information to the consumer about whether the product is still safe to consume. In this sense, so consumers would avoid the risk of incurring in foodborne illnesses. So for this presentation, I'm going to focus specifically on smart labels because this study, as anticipated, was run in collaboration with Mimica, which is a company that is actually developing and launching soon on the market a smart label with this purpose, so with the idea of reducing food waste. So why we should focus on this innovation? As I already a little bit anticipated, these are dynamic and provide real-time feedback. So in this sense, they are a counterbalance to static expiry dates. So expiry dates tend to be static because retailers and manufacturers need to be overly cautious in giving consumers information about when to consume the product. So what happens is that often expiry date leads consumers to waste the product that is still safe to consume, just because expiry dates have been developed with the idea of avoiding under all type of circumstances that consumer could eat something that it's not safe to consume. So the development of smart labels or also intelligent packaging could help consumers rely less on the static expiry date, because we know also from literature and research that consumers have a really weak understanding of how expiry date works and the different expiry dates, leading to confusion and misunderstanding, and ultimately to food waste inside the household. So overall, smart labels have the potential to contribute to the reduction of food waste. At the same time, however, despite these innovations being on the rise, there is scant research about how consumers react to these novel tools and also what consumers think about these potential new innovations. And in particular, the type of research that is out has kind of neglected to take into account the everyday context in which this innovation should be integrated. So the basis of this work is the idea that we need to account for the contextual factors in which food is used, stored, purchased and also disposed of in order to understand whether this innovation could be successful to reduce food waste. So in this sense, we take into account the concept of food handling practices, that there is basically just the collection of practices and activities that involve food at different stages. And this is particularly important to account for when talking about this topic, because research has shown that food handling practices are a key determinant of consumer-generated food waste. So we need to account for the way in which we interact with food in order to develop effective solutions that can help reduce food waste. Furthermore, this work is a qualitative work, and so it's in line with the call for more qualitative works focusing on the understanding of consumer-generated food waste, and for more work, qualitative work in the sense of consumer responses to innovations aimed at tackling food waste. So the goal of this project is twofold. So first of all, we start with the exploration of consumers' food handling practices and their perception of expiry date in relation to purchase, use, storage, and disposal of food. And then based on this information, we kind of explore consumers' reaction and responses to smart labels developed to tackle food waste. So to achieve these goals, we ran a qualitative study, and specifically we ran 3 online asynchronous and text-based focus groups in which participants were invited to participate on a platform, and on the platform every day questions were posted about specific tasks that consumers had to think about during the day. So the fact that consumers had the time to think more thoroughly about their ideas and their thoughts about the tasks proposed to them led us to have more in-depth information about their perception of smart labels, but also their ideas in relation to food handling practices. So in this sense, the data collection ran over the course of 7 days, in which we explore different topics related to the goal of our project. We specifically focused on the UK market because there is a raising awareness in UK about the relationship between expiry date and food waste, and also because many retailers and companies are actually launching mass smart labels that are aimed at extending the shelf life of food products and thus ultimately reduce food waste. As I said before, this project was run in collaboration with Mimica. So Mimica is a UK-based and award-winning company that has developed a label called Mimica Touch that becomes bumpy when the product is no longer good for consumption, and that stays flat when the product is still good for consumption. So in this sense, this label could complement expiry date in helping consumers make their decisions in store and at home. What we did with Mimica is that we used their label, which consumers are still unfamiliar with, as example of a smart label during the study. So participants, when they were introduced to the idea of smart labels, they were presented with a picture of a package of meat with the label on it. We chose red meat because the waste of red meat has the most negative impact on the climate. So we thought it was really relevant to explore how to avoid the waste of this product. So the data collection was divided into 3 phases. So on day 1, we explored the consumers' general perception of freshness and expiry dates. Then in the following 3 days, we explored consumer practices in relation to purchase, storage, use, and disposal of food. And then in the last 3 days of data collection, we explored consumer perception of smart labels and their effects on food handling practices. So in order to analyze the data, we did the content analysis. So we identified the main themes emerging from the text, and then we computed the frequencies of mention, meaning the number of participants that mention each specific theme during the data collection. So this is a really overall summary of findings, which I think is useful given the time limit. So as you can see, the results are presented in terms of the different phases of data collection that I was presenting before. As you can see, in parentheses, the numbers represent the number of participants out of 18 that mentioned the specific theme. So I will just give you a brief overview of the results. And as you can see, for instance, when we were exploring freshness perceptions, many participants mentioned using both expiry dates and sensory characteristics of the product to decide whether the product is still safe to consume. So sensory characteristics, meaning how the product looks, how the product smells, which is also related to what the founder of Too Good To Go was mentioning earlier in the presentation. So the idea is that consumers tend to use these 2 factors in tandem, in which we saw often participants mentioning that they will waste the product before the expiry date because it doesn't look good or it smells bad, while sometimes they tend to use the product after the expiry date, even because the product looks good or smells good. So of course there were differences among participants, and this was a really small sample, but this gives an idea about what is the decision-making process for consumer when deciding what is fresh and what is not. Also, participants enact different strategies that help them use the product for as long as possible. So the main strategy in this sense mentioned was freezing. So participants have a really desire to keep the product for as much as they can. So if they see that the product is close to the expiry date, they tend to put it in the freezer. And in this sense, we see a potential intervention of smart labels in the sense that smart labels will give you a real measure of whether the product is fresh or not to consume, that would allow you maybe to avoid freezing and so to change your storage practices. Again, as I think we can all expect and in line with prior research, expiry date are the main driver of choice in store, as well as the main factor looked at when deciding when to use the product. So when participants were introduced to the idea and the picture of smart labels, most of them were positive towards them, and they were also willing to try it in store. In this sense, because it's for the way the label is designed, it's possible to check inside the store whether it's flat or bumpy. On the other hand, though, so in this sense, participants recognized some benefits to the labels. Specifically, they will give them an external control of food freshness, so the peace of mind to know that the product is still good. While at the same time, some participants saw the link between food freshness and reduction of food waste. Of course, there are some trust issues that need to be overcome in order to reach full acceptance, because participants are completely unfamiliar with these new products. So in this sense, overall, we think that, so while consumers are open to these innovations, it's important to educate them in order to understand the characteristics of the product. And this could be done, for instance, through intervention both in and out of stores. So generally, we believe from the findings of the study that smart labels have the potential to influence both storage and use practices. And so I don't know if I think I'm over time.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm done. I can finish now. Thank you.
Great.
If you have any questions, please.
Go for it. Yeah, please post any questions in the chat. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. I think the whole kind of viscerality of how we interact with food and how that kind of goes over to labeling and these product innovations are really, really interesting. One of the questions I had was that what were the factors that perhaps influenced consumers' visceral engagement with packaging? Is it just about color and material, or are there other factors there? Is it to do with the environment where it is in the shop as well, maybe, where it is on the
if I understand correctly, so during the study, participants were asked to imagine being in a store. So we just show them the picture of the product. So we don't have many details in that sense, because this is a really preliminary work. So we have run another quantitative study in order to build on these results and see better which kind of, let's say, factors can affect, which factors smart labels can affect. For instance, we want to explore whether the fact that the product as a smart label might influence product quality or might influence your perception of the retailer. So, I mean, what we saw is that there is a big trust issue because participants do not really know them, but at the same time, they are open towards them. So I think it's a matter of letting them understand which is the benefit that they will get from these smart labels, and also helping them understand that, for instance, the addition of the label will not increase price, because this was kind of the concern, or also it will not increase the environmental impact of the product. Because some participants, of course, it was a really small sample, mentioned, but what if we are adding extra plastic So I'm creating a different problem while solving the food waste problem. So I think it's a matter of educating them mostly. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting. There's no other questions in the chat, so I'll ask another question. Are smart labels a competitive advantage for retailers? Could there be a situation where one retailer adopts smart labels and consumers choose to shop in that store because they use labels and other places don't?
So in the quantitative study that we ran, because we did a really simple experiment, so we had the control condition with the expiry date, then the smart label and the smart label with additional information. If I'm not mistaken, so we measured, for instance, the intention to switch. So what would you do if the product with the label is no longer available to the retailer that you found it the other time? So participants, when given more information, are actually willing to go somewhere else in order to find that product with the label, which is also in line with this idea that you need to give them more information to make them understand the benefits. So it's kind of, so there is kind of a hint that participants will be willing to also make an extra effort in order to get the product. And what we saw is also that the perception of environmental commitment of the retailer increases when there is the label. So it kind of also influences your perception of the retailer itself. So I think there is some kind of preliminary evidence in that sense. Yeah.
It's interesting that this is sort of developing over time, and I feel like the issue of smart labeling, it's been around for a few years, but it's not kind of taken leaps and bounds to be introduced yet. I wondered, is there like a further blockage factor that you feel with consumers that is sort of preventing it being implemented?
I mean, I don't know. I think the problem is that expiry dates are so established that I think it's really hard, and we saw it from the survey as well. It's really hard to tell consumers, do not rely on the expiry date. So I think it's easier to, what Jamie, I think his name was, said about the senses, and we saw it in the focus group as well. So people use their senses to judge the characteristics of the product. But what if the senses tells you this is bad, but then the smart label tells you it's good? So you have this clash between this incongruency between different signals, which I think it's a bit hard to resolve and needs consumers to get used to it, because they need ultimately to trust the technology, which happens only once, I mean, they are kind of have experience with it. So I think that's the main issue.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of consumers that don't trust expiry dates anyway. Yeah. So, okay. Great, thank you so much. Really good to meet you as well. Thank you for telling us about your research. Great. Oh, there is one question. We'll just do that quickly. I think we're due to move on very soon. How affordable and thus how accessible is this to smaller and independent retailers? That's a good question.
I'm not sure about that, because I think actually the label will not increase the price of the product. I think it's a matter, there must be a partnership. So my assumption is that once it kind of takes off, it will be maybe easier for smaller retailers to get the label as well. But I cannot give much details about that because I'm not really sure. Yeah,
I suppose there are implications for the whole kind of process of packaging and the machines that do this and how it's
they need a partnership with manufacturers and so on.
Yeah, okay. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. So I'll go next, and following me is my colleague Anesha, who's on the call as well. So I'll just share my screen. Hope you all can see that. So I'm going to present today what was one of 3 parts of my PhD. So as I said at the beginning, I'm a research assistant at the Centre for Business and Society here at Coventry University. But over the last sort of 5 to 6 years, I've also been doing a part-time PhD a day a week, and I finished that or graduated earlier this year from that. So my PhD looked at what are the kind of wider shaping factors that influence why we throw away food waste. And specifically today, I'm going to talk about the practice of planning. So it's very well established that we should be planning in order to avoid wasting food in our households. but I'll take a more kind of focused look at that, and even try and argue that people are planning to waste in some circumstances. So I'm talking today about planning to waste, addressing household food waste through resolving the practice of food planning. So as the last speaker said, we've already heard a lot today around why food waste is a problem, and it's an abhorrent issue facing an anthropogenic world. And at least in kind of Europe, America, and increasingly in countries like Indonesia as well, consumption patterns are largely responsible. So the activities of households, their shopping activities, etc., can be linked to why households are throwing away so much food. In the UK, it's a bit more of an issue as well, because we aren't always processing food waste properly. So there's 13 million households in the UK that don't have a separate food waste collection. And it can be an issue of almost like, do we change food purchasing? Do we change the kind of reduction versus prevention attitudes that we should be making the most of food waste material? But we are making progress on this. So this is pre-pandemic data, but according to RAP, there's been a 6% reduction in household food waste between 2015 and 2018. But really, I think there's a limited progress in addressing the unsustainable behaviours that we're kind of acting out. And often this is really individualised, so it's up to us personally to take action on food waste. It's not necessarily the problem of the system. So Jamie mentioned this in the end of his presentation. It's more that it's up to every single individual consumer to make an effort. And I try and argue in this presentation that the kind of disrupted nature of the way we live in our lives, it's going to be challenging for any consumer to really properly tackle and prevent food waste. So I tried to look at what were the kind of wider framing aspects of food practices that lead to food waste. So if you think about food planning, purchasing, its management and storage in the home, its preparation and cooking and its disposal, these are all kind of well discussed activities or behaviours that we can link to how and why households throw away food. But I wanted to look more ingrainedly at what about the rhythms and routines of work? What about school and what about leisure? What about different household cultures as well? And what about kind of wider circumstance of everyday life? You know, people might plan what they eat for dinner, but something comes up, the children want something different for dinner, etc. What then happens in terms of food waste? How are we adapting to that? And I think this is kind of missed out in some of the existing research. The other big factor to highlight here is the idea that a lot of our behaviours are mundane, they're automated, we're on kind of unconscious autopilot almost in every day. And whilst there's so much information out there about what we should be doing, planning, for example, I think constantly having that in the front of your mind is very difficult because people have other concerns. And I've linked this back to the attitude behaviour gap literature that says that, it's not enough just to tell people about the food waste, them to have a positive attitude. Actually, their behaviours can be very different. And in this piece of research, I had lots of examples of that. And I like this quote from David Evans, a prominent writer around food waste, that ecologically damaging forms of consumption are not seen as a problem of individual consumer behaviour, rather they are understood as an embedded within the prevailing organisation of practices. So it's this prevailing organisation of how we live that really should be the focus, because it's not just individuals putting things in bins. That's really kind of the behind the cause of what's the problem in total. And I had these two research questions. What is shaping how consumers' patterns of living and their consumption behaviours unfolding? And then how does this influence the transition of food into waste? And how do consumers respond and manage these shaping factors? And to what extent does this contribute towards the wastage of food? So it's this wider context of our life and what impact does that have on practices that lead to food waste. So I focus on planning, and I'd say that in the planning literature, it's kind of agreed that if you if you fail to plan ahead, then you're more likely to waste food. If you're more organised and accountable, you're less likely to waste food. But there are papers that sort of segment consumers into those that plan and those that don't plan. And I found that that's not always the case. I've had participants that will plan really well during the week, and then they get to the weekend and they don't plan at all. So I think it's more difficult to kind of understand how planning is undertaking, and the focus here was on is understanding how it's being resolved. So there's ideas out there around if we advise consumers to plan, how is this actually happening? Is planning a universal skill to be employed? Can we just tell people to plan? Do we have to give people more instructions of how to do this? What about when plans are interrupted and derailed? And almost as like an assumed stability in planning as well. So what about the wider context? I mentioned this. How is planning actually resolved? And what implications does this have for food waste? Now, I've mentioned practices, and I've underpinned this work with the theories of practice. So understanding how planning practices are resolved. I've taken some of this from Fyodor Shatsky's work on tele-effective structures, but basically practices are the main analytical unit of behavior, and we see a practice as a routine type of behavior, a collection of actions, etc. I won't go into detail, but just to make clear that this kind of replaces traditional thinking that food waste is being characterized by lots of kind of millions of decisions of people putting things in bins and their intentions, etc. We're looking at kind of wider practices that people undertake. So how are they interrupted, and how do people or how consumers navigate them? So in terms of the study, I undertook a multi-method study with 23 households. So I asked them for over the course of a week to take pictures of the food that they ate, shopped for and threw away. And then they also complete some mapping and they collected receipts as well. And then we'd sit down with them and I would go through what their week was like, what they ate during that week, what did they throw away. We'd go through receipts and say, okay, what happened to this yogurt? Was it eaten or was it not yogurt? Was it not eaten? They might tell me about any interruptions. So I had participants that might have, hospital appointments that were, suddenly not expected, or disruptions to do with the children or whatever it might be. And we talked about how that had implications for how they planned out food and what that meant for food waste as well. And this was a range of participants. They were mainly sort of middle income participants, but it went from kind of single household students all the way up to kind of larger families, older couples, etc. There was a range of different household types involved. So I'm going to talk about three main findings here. So obviously food planning normally is interpreted as a kind of formal meal plan, a menu, but really it was employed in lots of different ways and lots of different contexts as well. So some people just had a mental plan of what was for dinner, and they would keep that plan in their mind. Some people were organised, but this wasn't always really kind of consistent. So I'll talk here about one participant called Michelle. She was a mother living in her with a husband and daughter in her 40s. She had a weekly menu plan, and she said we just spend too much money on food and we weren't eating. We weren't eating the food that we were buying. The menu plan is used as a family calendar that tells Michelle where everyone goes and is supposed to be. So you can tell there that food planning isn't just always about what's for dinner, it's about organising the family. And there are times when meals are cooked that don't reflect the plan. So it doesn't mean that some of the food doesn't get thrown away. And the husband and daughter would come home from school or work and say that they don't want what's on the menu, which would then sometimes lead to food waste. So here are some of the pictures that this household took. And this is all the food that they threw away in the study week. And in my kind of mind, a lot of this I think still going to be eaten. So a lot of it was thrown away because of expiry dates, so very relevant from the previous presentation. But it might be because of the kind of viscerality of it. So because it's sort of hasn't, the product isn't expected to be what it is still. So it might be kind of gone watery, or maybe lost the crunch of a lettuce or whatever it might be. And this was the food that was thrown away. And I would ask the participant why this might be and link it back to some of the reasons that might relate to their routines and why these items weren't used up. So the second finding was that the food planning was this kind of mental, informal process. It's the process of managing, accounting, and coordinating, and it requires some kind of time. And I've called this mental organizational thinking space. So if you have got a very busy week, you might not even have time to plan and really sit down and think about what you're going to have for dinner. So I'm going to compare two participants now. So the first, Julie and Carl, a couple in their 30s, they say that they don't tend to plan. They plan when they shop at the supermarket. They might buy 2 or 3 things and then cook these throughout the week. They give the example of a roast chicken and ratatouille. This planning varies. So at the beginning of the week, they have more time, so they plan there. But sometimes Julia says that she can't be bothered to plan and ends up just eating quick stuff or whatever's in the pizza. So this shows this kind of inconsistency that we're not always planning when we should be planning, etc. It's not always kind of consistent practice that's employed. Comparing this with Andrew and Jenna, these were a couple in their 20s, but interestingly, they both commuted quite a long distance each to work, and they again said that they never plan, and they tend to eat the same thing every single week, if that makes sense. They eat the same thing every week, and they buy the same thing. They have more kind of set meals, more standard at the moment is what they eat, and they're not really varying the cooking. Andrew says here, it's not great, it's just dinner, it's nutrients. So they weren't as kind of foodie people, and they were very wasteful. So Julia and Carl previously wasted little food, whereas Andrew and Jenna wasted lots. And this was some pictures taken by the more wasteful household of food that they threw away. And they talked again about the viscerality of food. So if they only went shopping once a week, in a week's time, some of the items weren't as they were expected. They used a lot of kind of cling film or plastic wrap to try and kind of stop things going off. And you can see the kind of carrots and broccoli, and I think that was some maybe some kind of salad there, etc. But there wasn't much in their fridge at all. And then again, they kind of talked about the fact that they buy the same food every week, so it didn't really kind of matter to them much if they wasted some of it because they didn't use it up. So the third finding relates to kind of how this links to planning can cause waste to come about, if that makes sense. So planning is resolved in different ways up until different points at which the meal happens. So far away planning, you might have a proper meal plan, whereas nearer to the time of eating, it's just whatever's in the cupboard, etc. And there's different kind of competencies, standards, and resources that are behind kind of food preferences, and they play a role in how planning is resolved. So to give two examples, Kim here, who lives with her partner and two young children, said that I don't decide in the morning because I've got two kids to sort out. I've got to be at work at 8, so I sort it out the night before. Evenings are busy because the kids don't go swimming, etc. And Elizabeth here lives with her partner and two young children again. So it says in the evening it's easier to do planning, and it's important to give something to the kids quickly, and that's not a lot of prep. My husband is really very good at the research because he eats lots and there was not much food left over. So these participants were interesting because they were sort of saying that they can only plan at certain points during the week, depending upon how busy they are, and that planning is resolved in different ways. And again, I've got some pictures of their household and the food they had. And the left side is what they threw away during the study weeks. This is Elizabeth's pictures. And the right was their fridge that had loads of food in it, absolutely loads of food there. They had the freezer on the left and the fridge on the right. And I found it kind of challenging when I went to go and see some of these participants that they had wasted food. I mean, there was one instance where I visited a student flat and there was a Thai green curry that wasn't even meant to be green and that had been left in the fridge, for example. So the kind of viscerality comes out again in doing this research and how the planning is resolved relating to that. So to give some implications, I'm not quite sure if I've run over time. I think that's the end of my time. That planning concerns a wider remit than just the home. So we have to think about the everyday context of how people live, their routines, school, work, etc. And this plays a role in how planning is resolved. So at the moment, food campaigns, I don't think really appreciate this, and there's kind of like a subtle and a complex nature of how planning kind of plays out. It's not as simple as just asking consumers to plan. We need to acknowledge some of these wider pressures on consumers' lives. Asking consumers to plan is kind of only half the story. So there are better ways of managing the demands of everyday life, and there's all kind of value in mitigating food waste that relates to that. And I suppose I've written removing the fallacy, but the idea that we need to kind of promote consumer organisation, or there's kind of one clear moment that we can tackle to kind of ensure that consumers waste less food. I don't think it's as simple as that. I mean, people have complex lives, people have kind of disruptions, and although we can tell people to plan, it doesn't always kind of happen in the way that they think it does, which can mean food can then be wasted. So that's it. I think I've kept to time. So if there's any questions, put them in the chat, and then we'll perhaps move on to the next presentation. Okay. So one of my colleagues has asked me, what's the role of routines? So the routines were interesting because it relates to the way that people shop and people are going to make food and have that time at home. And some of the families had very kind of busy routines where they might mark out a specific time to plan, whereas others that had more time, that didn't necessarily mean that they wasted less food. They might still waste food, but planning was kind of less kind of stringent. So the role of routines might really be, where does food planning kind of fit into that, and how is it kind of resolved as well? I mean, for example, I think one of the participants worked at nights. So if you work at night, you can't go shopping during the day. So how does that impact how you go shopping, getting deliveries, etc., and then how you kind of cook food and during the week? So routines can play a role in how some of these practices that can cause food waste are perhaps disrupted or organised in different ways. So David has asked me, do you have a sense of how household food waste patterns have changed during the lockdown? Disruptions were reduced for many, so did food planning improve? So I would say, firstly, that I haven't seen any kind of conclusive research that we definitely know what's happening, but there have been some surveys out by RAP, for example, that suggest that food waste has lessened, so we aren't wasting as much food. And as David shows, it's because we're at home, etc. But it could be that we kind of, food's something that people turn to as a comfort during time of the pandemic. So we were very interested in kind of eating at home with our families or whoever we're spending the lockdown with. And that meant there was more focus on food, and also the fact that perhaps we weren't eating out as much as well. So we had to make the most of our food. With everything open up again, etc., in the kind of post-COVID recovery, there could be a bit of disruption that comes back again. But I think it would be interesting to see kind of what happens now where everyone is starting to eat out, etc. Are we going to go back to having kind of busy routines and not kind of placing planning correctly? So another question, if those busy families had a bit of time to help with your research, maybe they could have time to plan their meals better. Yeah, so there's a kind of temporality of this, that just because you've got time doesn't mean time to plan, doesn't mean that you're not going to waste food. That was kind of one of the main points. There were participants that I had that clearly had more times than others, but it didn't mean that they were wasting food, if that makes sense. Yeah, so, and that was quite interesting. There were times when I sort of wondered what they were doing and why, having food in the fridge, but then they would tell me during the study that they went out to eat, for example, and I would ask what happened to that food, and they would try and make it into something else, but sometimes it went in the bin. So I think it's difficult for some people to sort of say, I must use up that food. Food can be something that you can organise your life around if you want to go out for dinner, etc. A question from Carmela. So did you explore their intentions to reduce food waste in the study? So because I sort of took a bit of a practice approach, I wasn't as concerned around the kind of attitudes and intentions of my participants. It was more about the kind of practical reality of what they did. But I did have several participants that, I had two in particular that started the study saying that they're really good with food waste and they didn't waste any food. But then as I was in their homes looking around, this was before the pandemic, I undertook the research, I found lots of food waste. So that made me think that although some participants had the best intentions to not waste food, they told me about several items that went in the bin at the end of the day. And that much because it's the kind of complexity of everyday lives. We do have the intention not to waste food, but we are disrupted by this. I meant after study. Okay, so I think I'll leave it there and go to the next presenter, and that's my colleague Anesha.
Hello. Yeah, so I hope you can see me. 1 second.
There you go.
Yeah. So hello and thank you, Jordan. Fantastic presentation. So please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep, we're all good.
All right. So so I'm Anisha, and my area of research is largely food waste based, and particularly I have looked at suboptimal foods. So, your wonky carrots and, ugly fruit and veg, all of that. And this presentation is more about a research gap that needs more exploration. And in this presentation, I will be talking through some of the key arguments that I found in the literature. And it is also an extension of my PhD research, just like Jordan, you mentioned. And this was something, the concept of edibility actually emerged from the data that I had collected. But because it was not really matching with my research questions, I did not really explore it for the PhD. But moving forward, this was one thing that I wanted to look into. So, so starting off with edibility in food waste. Now, this is a widely contested topic, and most prominently, we tend to find this in the definitions. And the reason why there's a lot of definitional inconsistency is because we have not really successfully defined what edibility is. And we are seeing this now more prominently, especially with the latest food waste index report that has come out, that consumer food waste was underestimated. It's currently, the current levels are at least twice as much as it was reported in the past. And household food waste is also at 61%. So it is the measurement and estimation, and more importantly, how we define edibility that has greatly influenced our data and our measurement and estimations of food waste. And likely this is going to affect how we approach food waste. What sort of strategies do we come up with? So without going into details about what each of these definitions are, but just to give a brief overview of the definitions, it's so we start off with RAP 2009, which was one of the earliest definitions that were used, and they had categorized food waste into avoidable, possibly avoidable, and unavoidable food waste. And naturally, because you're talking about how much of the food that you're wasting could have been avoided or possibly avoided, you are dabbling with edibility as a concept, but not really overtly. You're not really defining that. Then comes FAO, and again, this ended up being another widely used definition, and they categorized wasted food as food loss and food waste based on where in the supply chain that is occurring. So naturally, food waste was more on the distribution and consumption end, and food loss was more towards the earlier stages of the food supply chain. And then came the Fusion's definition, which was highly simplified. So they don't really consider food waste as such, but all food that's wasted across all stages of the food supply chain was categorized as food waste. So they are not really considering edibility. And then comes the food loss and waste protocol, which differentiates food waste into edible parts and inedible parts. And this became the most widely, now at least, we are seeing more of this definition and the concept of edible versus inedible food being considered in the definitional scope. So this is something that is emerging in the literature. So again, reiterating my opening comment that the definitions of food waste have varied because edibility has not been well defined, and we don't know what its scope is. And some of the newer definitions, even those that are adopted from the food loss and waste protocol, those are now considering the edible and inedible parts, making edibility the pivot for determining what is food waste. So now, in line with the theme of the symposium, which is evolving the evolving food waste crisis and the future of food, definitely we are seeing edibility become the main theme, and this is not just limited to, say, one section of research. It could be it could be applied to several other areas. It could be household practices of storage. especially for products that have longer shelf lives. It could be used for suboptimal foods. It could be used for various other food-related practices, with fresh fruits and vegetables, keeping stuff in the refrigerator, even the research that Ada presented with using smart labels and determining whether this food is edible or not. So the main reporting standard that has brought this into the limelight is the Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard. And of course, it was developed to help quantify and reduce food waste in line with Target 12.3. But also it acknowledges edibility perceptions, and it highlights the importance of exploring that further, because this is something that will differ amongst different people. And these differences, most notably, we found that it does emerge across countries and cultures, but we also find more micro changes, like, when it comes to generations. So say younger people could be more hesitant to consume foods that they are unsure of, and there again, smart labels and intelligent packaging could come in to shape that and intervene any element of doubt. But this is where we need to be exploring more, and also for campaigns that are working towards kind of addressing this misinformation about whether food is edible or not, or breaking bad habits with food management. All of those need to consider how we are perceiving edibility. And this research, the research has also demonstrated the importance of determining the consumer response to avoidable and possibly avoidable food waste, which again links back to the earliest definition of food waste that was given by RAP. So like I said, suboptimal foods is just one example, but I think there are so many good examples that can be found in the sociological review, which is the volume 60 of 2012. It's a special issue that had come out for food waste, and it has some amazing examples of how consumers in their daily lives, they navigate through edibility and this concern with edibility. Right. So here is a question. So which of these bananas are edible? So what this means is that edibility perceptions are important. So it may not necessarily mean that food is inedible or edible. It's more about how we can actually encourage people to reduce waste. So for example, as a food waste researcher, to me, all of these are edible. The ones that have completely gone black, those could be repurposed. So understanding these perceptions would be really interesting to see whether consumers actually go ahead and repurpose. So what are some of their main decisions regarding whether they are choosing to throw away, whether they're choosing to use a product. And all these decisions rest on this threshold, is what I'd like to call it, because it totally depends on how people perceive and how they actually use this concept of edibility. This could also be perhaps linked with their habits and practices and what they have been socialized to do through life circumstances, but overall it tends to rest on how we perceive food to be edible. Now I'd like to also, what I find very interesting here is also Laura Bloch's research, which was, I think it was published in the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing. And this research actually calls for other researchers to understand some of the psychological underpinnings, but But what I wanted to highlight here through this excerpt is the need for understanding these boundaries. So I've actually highlighted that bit. So if I just read from the slide, it calls for, to do additional research on consumer perceptions of food dating. So this was specifically with regards to date labeling practices. And they're encouraging researchers to look at the extent to which consumers anchor or on provided dates, as well as the process of adjustment as a means of providing insight into the boundaries of a consumer's latitude of acceptance for consuming still edible food close to or past the labeled expiration date. So again, it's actually referring to a threshold that consumers could perhaps consider, and how do consumers actually navigate through that decision-making process. And they take the example of consumers not wanting to buy foods that are approaching the best before dates. And this is where the strategy of EDBP, or expiration date-based pricing, strategies have been used. And what is that psychological barrier that comes in place, and what has this how this edibility can play a role in consumers' decisions to whether or not they will buy or not buy, or consume or not consume. And of course, you also have the social and material context of everyday food consumption. And this was a research done by Watson and Meyer, and it was published in the Sociological Review, volume 60, 2012. So this again shows some of these differences in how edibility is perceived. So here's a mom whose daughter, who's aged 11, is absolutely obsessed with sell-by dates, and she's always compulsively checking whether the date is right. And so the mother mentioned about her daughter being, she checks the sell-by date, and she even mentions this to her mom, that the crisps in her lunchbox were out of date, and she could have eaten some and possibly could have fallen sick, or and that concern is coming out from 11-year-old girl. On the other hand, you have another individual. I think this quote is coming from a 40-year-old man who does not really trust date labels, and what he says is he comments on our practice of throwing away food, and how he has grown to be less reliant on labels and more reliant on his own senses. Now, this could highlight a generational difference, but it also highlights, the variability in our perceptions of edibility and what really has influenced how we perceive edibility. And in this slide, I'd like to talk a bit about my research for my PhD. So I looked at how children perceive suboptimal fruits and vegetables. So, it builds on some of the work that Jessica Aschemann-Witzel has done, where, you're talking about, specifically suboptimal foods in general. So that could be foods with any packaging damage, or foods close to or just gone past the best before dates, or it could be, wonky fruits and vegetables. And whilst a large majority of children, they expressed positive attitudes towards suboptimal fruit and veg, but there were also some children who said that, I think they are cute, but I know I will not be eating this at home because it is either fed to pets, or it's composted, or even worse, it's binned. There were also children who basically they expressed negative attitudes because they were doing this, and there was this gap, there was this attitude behavior gap, where they clearly said that no, they actually like it, they find it fun, but they will not be fed this, or their parents won't be buying such stuff. And this influences whether leftovers, or in this case suboptimal fruits and vegetables, are eaten, or whether they are repurposed, or whether they are wasted. So it is that decision of avoiding or not avoiding waste that is at stake if we don't quite understand how these edibility perceptions emerge. And that again underlines Nicole's research that consumers' perceptions of edibility is vastly different from consumers' actual consumption. So while people can actually say that, this food, this broccoli stock, for example, is perfectly edible, but I wouldn't eat it. And then there is that trade-off that's happening with, your perception of edibility and your actual consumption. So whether you actually end up using that food or not. Now, why understanding edibility is important. Now, as we're moving ahead in, reaching a target 12.3, we are faced with upcycling food, and upcycled food is now becoming the newer trend. In many parts of the world, you have upcycled food certifications and standards that are coming up that retailers are going to stock in the, hopefully in the months to come. And even I think for those of you who will be joining tomorrow, you will be you would be able to meet Francesca Goodman-Smith, and she was one of, she's a friend and colleague who is now working towards developing food standards for upcycled food, and they are in the process of doing this for Australia and New Zealand. And if we understanding edibility becomes essential, because if we don't understand that, how will we know whether consumers will be willing to accept upcycled food? And also from the business point of view, which is for the next example of imperfect foods, whether it's dented cans or using practices like EDBP or imperfect fruits and veg, these have now turned into business strategies, and the viability and whether the commercial prospect of these initiatives rests on consumers' edibility perceptions. And so therefore there is a threshold that that households or consumers consider when they choose to repurpose or consume food that would otherwise be unwanted. So what happens if that food crosses that threshold? What decisions follow? So it could be, how food is used. It may not be, say, if it's a piece of fruit, it may not be eaten the same way. It could perhaps be juiced, or it could be frozen and used in some baked stuff and repurposed. So, it depends. It could potentially affect what is done with that food that is unwanted. The food product would the food product be rejected and eventually wasted? That could also be another possible outcome. Now, I've called it the edibility threshold. I'm happy to even change the name if there's some issue with how it can be defined. But I'm really looking forward to some feedback on this concept. And also, understanding this threshold becomes important because as we're moving forward, we are creating and implementing many social marketing campaigns designed to increase consumers' tolerance for suboptimal foods. And we're looking for more viable and easily implementable solutions. So this is where getting to know this edibility and debunking many edibility misperceptions become really key. And it should also help in encouraging repurposing, because that's a good way in which we can reduce the amount of household food waste, because as the latest data shows, it stands at 61%. So, so with this, I'd like to thank you for your time, and thank you for listening to me, and I'm open to suggestions and feedback on this presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think that's really interesting. I mean, a part of my work also looked at this difference between almost like this kind of imagined perception of what things taste like when you go around the supermarket and what they're actually like when you have them at home, and the in-performance eating of food. But it's a really interesting concept. We have gone over time a little bit, so if it's okay, we'll just do 2 questions. So there was just a question there from Katrine about, in your research, have you looked at or come across any changes in perception over time? So as consumers have become more aware of food waste as a result of news reports, have perceptions and approaches to edibility changed?
So far, we don't quite know about whether they've changed over time. We would like to see more adoption of repurposing practices and lesser food waste. But because the definitions have changed and how we measure food waste has changed, what that has done is the data shows that we are wasting more food, but that's also because of the measurement of food waste. So if you change the measurement, the outcome changes. But overall, yes, things like banana bread is becoming more and more popular. Juicing and smoothies and vegetable stocks, for example, these are becoming very popular. So yes, households are, in a way, in some pockets, perhaps they are changing. We are definitely seeing this in New Zealand, but New Zealand is not the perfect example for the world, because they're quite isolated, and typically the New Zealand population, they are quite green tinged. And even the place where I had collected my data with children, they come from a school that's relatively green tinged. So they have been studying about food waste, and they're setting up their own community gardens. And so this information that's coming from them, it also shows that they are almost doing one thing in school, but at home that may not be fully implemented. And overall, I feel that this is an opportunity for businesses and practices and the government to encourage people to repurpose. It's one of the best ways to make sure food doesn't go into the bin. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think we're going to get time for all the questions. So can I ask you to put your email address in the
Yes,
chat, and if people want to get in contact with you, they can.
Yeah.
We'll just have one more question before the next. We've got 2 presenters still to go. So this one from Kamala. So would you say edibility also affects how consumers decide on which food item they share with food sharing apps like Olio? It could have some implications to platforms to guide consumers about this.
Yes, I think that's a fantastic question. So this does affect what type of food is shared, and it does influence. There's always this risk that we take because our perceptions of edibility tends to differ, and this risk is something that we've got to deal with, which is why it's a suggestion and that edibility as a concept has to be explored further. And we need to understand how we are perceiving and what are we doing with our perceptions of edibility. How is it translated? How is it generalized? And how that can be incorporated into practices, and getting edibility into households, and getting them to waste less food. So there's more about implementation from something that's very conceptual and something that varies from one person to another.
Yeah, it's like a kind of bodily appraisal, because their own kind of visceral reality of what food's like, and everyone, I suppose, interprets it differently depending upon their situation. And again, we've had comments on how that might change over time depending on what you know about food waste, etc. That's really interesting. Okay, great, thank you so much. Yeah, and as I say, you put your email in the chat. I'm sure people can ask you any further questions. So we'll move on to our next speaker. So we've got 2 speakers left. The next speaker is Natalie Pearson from the University of Bath, who's here. So I'll hand over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I will just share my screen.
Great, we can see that. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So yeah, I'm Natalie Pearson. I'm well, just going into my final year of my PhD at the University of Bath, and my research is still slightly ongoing, and it's about hospitality food waste and how we influence others to prevent food waste. So in the hospitality industry, it's really difficult to actually measure food waste and get accurate figures. I mean, the figures provided here are sort of 10 years old, but part of that reason is because of the complexity of the industry, kind of the lack of engagement to some extent, things like not being obliged to report, and also, as we were just talking about in terms of edibility and things, actually the problem with the definitions and actually saying what is and what isn't food waste as well. So when I did my pilot study, one of the things that really struck me was this idea of like how we talk about food waste. So like, how do we talk about food waste so that we can increase awareness among people that work in the industry and beyond that, and so that we can then also enable effective and meaningful action and change. So to do this, I've been looking at it through the lens of sense making, and in particularly focusing on Sensegiving Theory, which I'll explain briefly in the context of some of the key questions in my research. So sense making is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's this process of looking and noticing what's going on, interpreting it, and then coming up with plausible solutions. So thinking about hospitality food waste, how do people that work in hospitality actually, what sort of sense do they have of what food waste actually is? And then how do they use this sense to actually tackle food waste and come up with plausible solutions? But then beyond that, how do they actually talk about it with other people? How do they influence other people? How are they influenced by other people? And this is where the sense-giving side of things come in, because it's about influencing how others make sense of the problem as well. And particularly in organizations, how can you actually influence someone towards this preferred definition of reality, this preferred definition of what food waste actually is? And of course, on the other end of that, the people within an organization aren't just influencing others to prevent food waste, they're also being influenced themselves. So how are they influenced by others? And also, how does the environment that they're situated in affect this as well? So today I've done 19 individuals with a range of people that work across the hospitality industry. And it's important to have this range of individuals as well, because it goes some way to actually address the complex nature of the industry and the different the ways different establishments, restaurants, hotels, cafes, catering companies, etc. so on work, and also the type of business and the position someone has within the business can actually affect the level of influence that they've got. So the findings that I'm going to present kind of capture 3 of these different levels in a way. So firstly, on one end, you've got people like sustainable chefs and sustainable business owners, where they've got quite a high level of internal and external influence. And then more in the middle, you've got catering managers, cafe managers, restaurant managers, and so on, that tend to have a bit more of a high level of internal influence. And then at the other end, low-level employees that tend to have a much lower level of influence. And one thing with these different positions as well is that this also influences to some extent how they the sense they have of food waste. So identity in sense making is one of the key components, and I think this is shown particularly in this. So for someone that works in a front of house position, their sense of food waste is very much dominated by what's left on a consumer's plate at the end of the day. And so the sense making that they engage in, it tends to be focused on sort of portion size and offering consumers doing recommendations on a certain meal size, or suggesting that perhaps they share a cake and things like this. Those in more managerial positions tend to have a much more monetary sense of what food waste is. I mean, quite a few people use the expression money down the drain. And so this is something that then is used when they are thinking about ways to prevent food waste. You know, it's how can they save money on this, and what way can they alter the way the menu is designed and things like this to actually prevent food waste. And then on the other side, you've got the sustainable businesses, where they tend to have this much more holistic sense of what food waste is. So it incorporates things from packaging and also considers the other end in terms of what it's then made into as well once it's been disposed of. You know, is it turned into compost that then grows their vegetables that they take back into the restaurant, for example? And they tend to have this very clear sense of what food waste is. And also as well, a lot of them challenge what it is that we perceive to be edible too. So these different perceptions influence how sense about food waste is made within the business, and therefore the influence they send out to other people, and what they do to prevent food waste. So, for example, in the more sustainability businesses, the sense making they go through tends to be a lot more explicit, and they kind of go through this progress of figuring out the effective systems and policies of dealing with food waste. Whereas in the more mainstream business, and again in day-to-day business in general, no matter what type of business hospitality business it is, it's very much implied and part of the job, and depends on skills and experience and things. So, for example, if someone, one of the ladies I interviewed commented about how she had adjusted the portion size of a burger and chips because she'd kept noticing that a lot of the chips were coming back. And it was one of those things that she did just out of the experience she had and things like that. And it wasn't until talking to me about it that she actually recognised what she'd been doing and that she does do it. And she also was quite proud about the fact that she kind of does more than she thinks. So then when it comes to influencing others to prevent food waste, as I mentioned before, the sustainable businesses tend to have a bit more of this sort of internal and external influence. So internally, there's this focus on making people notice what's going on by making things very clear and obvious. So the example here is about changing bin colours so that the staff are a lot more awake and actually notice, and so will automatically separate their waste rather than just dumping it in a bin because there's a bin there. You know, he also emphasised about making sure that you use the right language and using it in a way that won't put people off. And these sort of things extend to customers and so on as well. And of course, a lot of these sustainable businesses, when I'm talking about external influence, have influence not just on the people that work for them, but also customers, suppliers, other businesses, and in a few examples, government as well. And so in these instances, they tend to use, you know, the modes of communication that are most appropriate for that person. And also if and so on. And then likewise in mainstream businesses, the sort of ideas of using the right language and using tailored and focused methods as well were one of those things that came up, and particularly the need for some clarity and regular reminders. However, one of the biggest challenges is that there are obviously a lot of people that have worked in the industry, or particularly the same business, for a long time and tend to become quite stuck in their ways. You know, the quote here talks about not being old school people, but people have also commented about how, you know, someone just has been doing it for so long that they're like, this is the way I cook, this is the way I do things, and then they've not got that openness and willingness to change their behaviours. So of course, that's one challenge that needs to be overcome. The cook that's shown here works for a national restaurant chain, and she also identifies some of the difficulties within larger businesses because, of course, they've got this, you know, more levels that they've got to negotiate in terms of influencing how things are done within the business. So I imagine that this particular interview was somewhat of a rarity. I mean, she's very vocal in attempting to influence her manager and her colleagues and the organisation in terms of food waste. So she's continually questioning her manager, and she's having conversations with the people she works with. And then in the more organisational sense, she's making sure she's filling out the sort of the feedback forms and being very vocal about offering suggestions on what they could do about food waste. And I think one thing that's really noticed me with this particular quote was that she said, "I'm sure I wasn't the only one that was doing that. Like, there must be other people as well." And because it's the company asking them for the feedback, they should take everything on board and consider it. So I think what comes from this is that, you know, there's that strength in numbers. It's important to be persistent and constantly questioning, especially if you're working in an organisation or where it is much more difficult to get through to someone and you can't do it on a one-to-one basis. So being influenced by others, one of the very key influences for everyone was things like family and upbringing, but for, say, the sustainable chefs and sustainable business owners, it was much more broader influence than that, you know, particularly coming from others in the field, and they showed this very strong openness. Were constantly learning and being proactive, so there was almost this sense that they were asking others to influence them and asking others to actually teach them more about food waste and sustainability so that they could learn more and actually make improvements as well. The catering manager as well, you know, she showed this openness and as well to others' views, and particularly a respect for others and those that are generally ignored as well. So she works in a student venue, and so a lot of the staff that work there are students, and she commented in another quote about how the students are often ignored and people don't value their opinions, but she recognises that actually they've got some really great ideas as well, and so it's really important to consider those as well. For the cook and other employees in similar positions, the influence by family and friends was definitely the most significant, more than anything. And what this showed was that they're more likely to listen to those closest to them. And then they also recognised the importance of respect as well. So if it was a manager, you know, that they were trying to offer a suggestion to about how to prevent food waste, and they'd feel much more like what they were saying was going to be received if they had mutual respect for each other. So all of this goes on within this busy, unpredictable hospitality environment. You know, and I love this expression about there being so much energy transfer in the restaurant, so many things going in and out, because I think it just sums it up so nicely. And, you know, equally, they've got this focus on customer service, food quality, food safety, profit, all of these things that kind of just make up this landscape that food waste, that tackling food waste is happening within. And in some instances, it can cause barriers, and in others, it can, you know, they can work alongside each other, but it's finding that kind of happy medium where they can be mutually beneficial to each other in a way. And again, there's that difference between sort of larger businesses and smaller businesses. So larger businesses, they've always got those multiple levels to negotiate, and there's limited flexibility. So the environment almost restricts certain things happening. Whereas within smaller businesses, they can be more flexible and spontaneous and almost respond to the environment. So it's kind of almost creating this ideal environment to actually give sense to others about food waste, but then also make sense about what's going on as well. And then secondly, there's also the wider environment to consider as well, because of course, you know, it's not just what's going on in the hospitality business, it's actually the things that are going on outside the business that have this great impact as well. So, you know, and sort of create noise and create sort of enabling conditions, but then also create barriers as well. And this can be things like, you know, Brexit, even just other sustainability issues such as focus on plastic waste or veganism, and you know, there's so many other things talked about. And of course, over the last year and a half, it's been, you know, COVID has obviously been something that's been talked about quite a lot. And what I found really interesting was, as I kind of went through my interviews, was right at the beginning, there was this this sense that, you know, minds were on other things. People weren't actually receptive to sort of messaging about food waste and other issues that related to climate change and so on, because their minds were on other things. But as the pandemic sort of progressed and sort of hospitality's opened up and closed and so on, it's sort of reached a point where people have sort of woken up to it a bit more, and it's actually had this sort of amplifying effect on food waste and sustainability concerns. So just to sum up, so far I've identified that some of the sort of enabling conditions in terms of in terms of influencing others about food waste prevention is, if it's one-to-one, to have this kind of tailored, focused approach. Whereas if it's a wider audience, then multiple methods are necessary so that you can kind of reach everybody in a way that resonates with them. And it's important to focus on the language used and the appropriate method of communication as well, while having clarity, consistency, and persistency. It's obviously so much easier as well if the person on the other end of, you know, the person that you're trying to influence, if they're open and willing to learn. And it's also much easier if they're in kind of close proximity to each other, whether this is emotionally or physically. So one of my participants talked about how in their restaurant they've got an open kitchen, so they'll pre-COVID times they'd have people sitting around the kitchen, and the chefs would actually be able to talk directly to their customers and actually share what they're all about, basically. And it's also much easier as well if there are the similar attitudes and values and identities between the two people. But of course, the challenge here is that you're kind of preaching to the converted, and it's how do you then reach those that aren't? And what my research is suggesting so far is that even if you've got kind of one of these sort of enabling conditions in the way that you try and contact someone, then you will eventually get through to them. It's just that kind of keeping things up, trying to talk to people in a way that resonates with them, being persistent, but then also creating or negotiating the environment around you to actually be able to talk about food waste in a way that's actually going to lead to increased awareness and effective and meaningful change. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. That was really interesting. I actually done some research previously on food waste at university, so some of those findings definitely kind of compared with what I found out before, but that's really, really interesting. It's almost like food waste sometimes is like a dirty word when you're in hospitality, because the goal is just to kind of, you know, run the catering as efficiently as possible. And if you have to kind of change some processes that might make it slower, but you waste less food, and that can cause challenges. So are there any questions for Natalie? I mean, I've come up with some myself. There was one about where the research was undertaken, so perhaps you could tell us a bit more about that. Yeah.
So yeah, it's undertaken with UK predominantly English actually based businesses, or so some of the people I've known through sort of hospitality experience in the past, and then also through contacting people that own or work in businesses that are particularly, you know, that are sustainability led.
Okay. Yes. So one of the questions I had was, is there a difference between some of the actions that these workers take between kind of larger and smaller companies? Because I imagine in some of the larger ones where, so for example, at Coventry University, I know the catering is kind of contracted to a company. Maybe their remit to have some kind of change on the food waste is is limited because they're part of this large company, and is that different perhaps for more independent businesses?
I think it's hard to say at the moment. I mean, the area I'm struggling to get as many as much access to is generally the larger organizations. So I've not got quite as much data on that side as yet. But I think, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of the sort of larger organizations, if they're doing anything in terms of food waste, it's things that are written into their policies, and they are, or things like in terms of separating waste and things like that, they've got to do it. Whereas with smaller businesses, because they don't make as much of it, they've not got that same inclination, for example. So yeah, there are differences, but probably not always the way that you'd expect it, actually, in a way.
Okay. One of the other questions I had linked on from, we had a keynote speaker, Jamie Crummy, the co-founder of Too Good To Go, and he spoke about how his Too Good To Go app works with some companies, and that's more about sharing food to tackle food waste. Whereas I know that other kind of catering companies will go down the route of having like a trim track machine to kind of ground up food that's been thrown away, to maybe put this in the kind of water system, or make some kind of anaerobic digestion from that. So the question was, where does the balance lie between companies taking action to prevent food from going to waste in the first place, like sharing food, or actions that predominantly are on like just reducing the actual food waste material? So food waste has happened, and then they're dealing with it in a different way.
Yeah, I think, when I talked about at the beginning about like the sense that people have of food waste, I think that very much comes into it as well, because for those that, particularly for those in those sustainability-led businesses where they've got this really strong sense of what food waste is to them, they will put things in place across like every single point of what they're doing. So they will, they're challenging sort of what is perceived as edible for some reason, to some extent as well, because they're doing inventive things with certain ingredients, and they're making sure they're preserving, and they're doing all these things, and then they're working with farms to where anything that they can't actually make anything with, then whereas for sort of more mainstream businesses, there's, I think a lot of it is things that are kind of done because it's part of the job, and it's almost like a food safety thing as well in terms of food management, where it's things like making sure that they're stock rotating and they're not ordering too much. And so there's kind of that focus at the beginning, and then there's also perhaps that focus at the end where they're separating food waste, so that it's not going to landfill and it's going to anaerobic digestion, for example. But it's almost that bit in the middle where perhaps there's not so much attention.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so one last question I noticed we haven't had any more there was, I thought the insights around hospitality workers was really interesting. It was really, really good to hear kind of like almost their perspective on what it's like to kind of deal with food waste in that environment. So is kind of tackling food waste for them an opportunity to do something new and really kind of take initiative, or is it like a drain on, it's another thing to think about at work?
I think it depends who you talk to, and I think that also, I think it also links quite well with the whole the environmental factors, and actually setting up the workplace and the environment so that it actually enables people to, to make it easy for them. Like Jamie at the beginning was talking about the role of simplicity and things, and actually that's another thing that's really key, is making it simple, it's got to make people's life easier, because there's so much other stuff going on. It's that really busy environment, there's not so much other stuff going on, so actually how do you make it so that it's just part of the day-to-day routine, and they don't think about it, but they do.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Thank you so much. It's really, really interesting. Best of luck with your PhD as well. It sounds really, really interesting. So we'll move to the last presentation. I think I've seen the speaker in the call. Let's try and find them. Diana, yes. Hello. Thank you for joining us. So you and your colleague are from the University of Portsmouth?
That's right.
That's right. Okay. I'll let you share your presentation.
So, okay. So I'm going to talk about identifying new product opportunities from waste, eliminating waste in tomato production. So I am working in both the University of Portsmouth and this company that is on the Isle of Wight. So the content is, well, who is the producer, the definition of the problem, identification and quantification of waste, how to mitigate food waste produced by the company, a new framework that we're proposing for product development with an example, the advantages and disadvantages, and the conclusion. So this producer is, as I said, based on the Isle of Wight. We have 26 hectares of greenhouses. We produce around 100 varieties of tomatoes. The entire growing system is biodegradable. And we have our own composting facility to reduce fertilizer inputs, improve the soil fertility, structure, and other things. We also have a small production kitchen for condiments, juices, and sauces. We have something around 22 products, counting the fresh produce as well. And the fresh produce. Then the definition of the problem. So the producer sends around 580 tons of tomatoes annually to the compost site. This varies with the years, but it's more or less an approximation. And this represents a loss of around 880,000 pounds in sales. Well, this situation happens mainly because of different causes, but some of the main causes are that the retailers ask for a certain number of tomatoes attached to the vine. So if there are more tomatoes growing in the same vine, but they have to cut them and discard that bits of the vine. The tomatoes are usually green and small. Well, the ones that we remove, especially from the tip, but some others are turning color. They need to be disposed. Some others are aesthetically unacceptable, or have some kind of microbe or thing growing that is unacceptable as well. Also, at the end of the season, the demand for fresh tomatoes decreases. So we have lots of fresh produce. And then when producing some condiments, juices, and sauces, the seeds and skins of the tomatoes are discarded, which is also waste. The identification and quantification of waste. So it's basically two main sources. The one from unripe, imperfect, damaged, and overripe fruits is more or less 9% of the total greenhouse production. And from when tomatoes are processed to produce the condiments, sauces, and juices, we get something around 5% of the total kitchen production. In seeds and skins, the water is a little bit difficult to quantify. So how to mitigate the food waste produced by the company? Well, since the company has already implemented as many steps as possible to reduce its environmental impact and food waste, the waste produced at the moment needs to enter into a different process where a thorough analysis of the parts of the waste needs to be done. There is the opportunity to upgrade waste to higher margin products as opposed to downgrading waste, which is currently the norm. And this analysis can be explained with a new framework for the identification and evaluation of new product opportunities. So this is what we are proposing. This new framework contains three main aspects or components: the nutritional component, the functional component, and the sensorial component. And this has been very useful, because for every stage, for example, if I have very green tomatoes that need to be discarded, or if I have rotten tomatoes, that is literally the other side of the spectrum, I've been checking from beginning to end, what are the nutritional properties, the functional properties, and the sensorial properties of all these tomatoes in order to know what to do with them. Which I believe, because of some of your presentations, that it could be also useful for the household, because, for example, Jordan, in your presentation, you mentioned something about a lettuce that was disposed because it was very soft. In my perspective, I might be wrong, that is still edible and it doesn't represent risk at all in terms of health. It is just because it doesn't look like the marketing, which it's a pity, but I don't know, might be wrong. But for example, in the same sense, if we're talking about a sensory aspect of another kind of food product, and we're not talking about, for example, the microbiological aspect of the same product, there are some products that can be risky in terms of the sensory and others in terms of the microbiological risk. Like, for example, rancid oils, they can, if they reach a point of rancidity, even if they don't have any microbiological problems, the amount of radicals that they can have can represent risk to the health. While, for example, in the same sense, the sensory aspect of the lettuce, it just was damaged, but the microbiological aspect was not there. Well, maybe, I don't know. So it can be edible instead of it can be eaten, sorry, instead of being disposed. So, for example, one of the things that I've made for the seeds and the skins, which is the waste that we bring out from the production, is that the seeds, in terms of the sensory, they increase the hardness in flatbread. In terms of the nutritional aspect, sorry, well, they are rich in essential amino acids like 309 and lysine, fatty acids, oleic and palmitic, and this lycopene, that is a carotenoid. The functional aspect is that they are effective in removing organic dye molecules from color textile effluents. This is all research-based. The skins, in terms of the sensory, well, they improve the mouthfeel, particularly when used as fat replacer in low-fat products. They reduce the formation of lumps in food products as well. In terms of nutrition, they are rich in essential amino acids like glycine, valine, and leucine. And the minerals, calcium, potassium, sodium, and magnesium, they're also rich in that. And of course, they contain lycopene. Well, tomatoes in general are very high in lycopene anyway. And in the functional properties, they are partially permeable to liquids and gases, these skins. So they have potential to be used as material for biodegradable packaging and tableware. They can also extract from them crystalline cellulose, which is a very good excipient for medicines. And they can also be used as lacquers for application on the outside and inside of tin plate cans for food. And this is some of the examples. So this person called Diane Leclerc is well designing and producing from tomato skins and tomato waste these vessels. Well, the lacquers have been produced, well, yes, and researched by BioCopac. And the lycopene supplements are relatively popular. They're in the market. And the flatbread improvement, that's just another example. So what are the advantages and disadvantages? The advantages is that by using this very analytical process, we have been able to reduce food waste. Where we have discovered new product opportunities. We have invented some innovative ingredients for the food industry. We have been noticing some innovative solutions for other industries. And of course, and most important, I believe, the maximized use of nutrients. In the disadvantages, well, we have the waste normally needs processing in order to be used, which increases environmental footprint of some of the products. Reusing waste to produce other products create other kinds of waste. And customers may not receive well the new ingredients. And reusing waste in other industries can make it difficult to compost afterwards as well. So as a conclusion, well, our case study analysis reveals the volumes of different types of tomato waste produced and reveals the different sensory, nutritional, functional properties of each. We then demonstrate how, through an analysis of each of these properties, it is possible for firms to uncover the product opportunities that each presents. And yeah, that's it. I try to make it fast.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. It's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, one comment I'd have is, I mean, I've been lucky enough to work with a retailer in South Africa, and I've been on a tomato farm and seen a huge amount of waste there once, and it's staggering how much thrown away. And you said the huge amount gets thrown away by, well, not thrown away, but made into anaerobic digestion or whatever by the farmer that you're working with. Yeah, I wondered what implications your research had to more like the procedures that perhaps are further down the supply chain. So retailers might say that, you know, a product needs to be packed in a certain amount of time. It only might have, you know, the implications for date labels, etc. So, you know, how does kind of further knowledge around the kind of material and the properties of tomatoes in your case, how does that have implications then for retailers and how they give instructions to farmers, etc.?
Well, the way in which I'm doing everything, because I'm a food scientist, so I am taking certain parts of the tomato waste and I process this into a very different product. So basically, it's very difficult for anybody to know what was it before because it has been transformed dramatically. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's just, you know, are there things the farmers can do that will help you produce what you produce that makes sense? Is it just a case of collecting the waste or?
Oh yes, yes,
yeah.
I have helped implementing a system where they now can quantify the waste lots better in both the kitchen and the greenhouses. So in this sense, I can control a little bit better what's happening, and also to see how much we can produce from one product or the other.
Okay. And when these products are marketed, I don't know if you know, this might be a bit out of the reach of your presentation, but is there an opportunity to say that these are products that are made from food that would otherwise be wasted, perhaps?
Yes, some of them. Or for example, the surplus cannot be mentioned as waste because in terms of marketing, people think that was something very bad with them. Well, it was absolutely nothing wrong with them. It was just that it became waste if we don't do anything with them.
I see.
So yeah, it depends on what part of the tomato I'm using for that product.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose the other thing to think about is what's the kind of economic viability of these products? Is it the case that you know, we need to sort of choose to use the tomato waste to make these, or is it that there is some kind of newer material out there that's cheaper to use? You know, is it competitive on the market? What's being produced?
Yes, it is competitive in the market. We've already done the market research.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. Okay, great. And is there a process of signing up more kind of farmers? What's the next stage of your research?
My next stage is well, just to finish some of the designs of the products, and then to check how much we are every year reducing the surplus and the waste. That's basically it.
And we've had a question about have any of the successful innovations reached mainstream markets?
Yes, I can't say much about that, but yes, a couple of them. Okay,
that's good. How does that process take place then? Are they pushed forward by any certain actor in the market?
The producer also makes some sales online of the products.
Okay.
But because these products are made with surplus and not with what we would call waste, like non-edible tomatoes, that's why he doesn't say it is waste.
I see. Okay, so a different term is used. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Well, that's really interesting to hear. Thank you for sharing that with us. That was really, really interesting.
Okay.
So that was the final presentation in this track. And just to summarize, we've had some really, really interesting kind of thoughts put forward. There's definitely a theme there around perception of edibility that came across in several of the presentations today. Also kind of concerns around not just the role of consumers, but the role of wider industry as well. Yeah, really, really interesting. I just wanted to finish by sharing the International Food Loss and Food Waste Studies group. And this is a group that I kind of co-founded and run. And this is a kind of online group where we have a Google Groups platform. And I think there's nearly 400 people sign up to this now. It's like a listserv. So if you have like an interesting paper to share or a new piece of research or perhaps an interesting report, you can send this out and people will kind of find out about it. We have questions on there sometimes perhaps from PhD students that are interested in a new methodology or a certain way of doing something that are posted as well. It has a website and a blog, and there's also a Twitter page as well. But if you're interested, take a look at foodwastestudies.com on there, and there's been a chat. Okay. But yeah, thank you to all the presenters. So in terms of what's next, we're going to have a short break now until 1:15, and then we'll return with the first panel debate, which will be what enabled and constrained community food groups during the pandemic. And this will be on this Zoom call. But there's a short lunch break now. I wondered as well if the speakers had any other comments they wanted to share. So I think it's been quite a kind of interesting track debate. You don't always see a track that's just on food waste, symposiums, etc. And I thought it was quite interesting that we've got this industry role with the hospitality and the farming, etc. There. But anyway, thank you to all the speakers. And if there's no further comments, we'll return at 1:15.